All right, folks, welcome to the next episode of Every Citizen Armed. Today's episode is going to be brought to you by Branded Feed and Farm Supply. They're here in Bakersfield at 4328 Rosedale Highway. Run over there. You can actually get your horse feed, your dog food, your chicken food. Talk to Seth and the guys. They've got pretty much anything you're going to need, but a lot of information to help you out. We really appreciate their support. Those are the folks that are going to help us keep this thing going as we move forward. Now, today we're going to have Brian Miller as our guest. He's a retired CDC officer, which now is, I guess, CDCR, which we'll talk about in the episode. Great story, really good guy, one of the more intelligent people I've met in my life. And I think the things that he has to say might really surprise some folks. But I think in there's a lot of knowledge that you could get out of what he has to say. Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to him. I've known him for years, and I've always been real impressed with him. So I hope you feel the same way, and now we'll move forward.
Every citizen armed ensures that every American patriot is prepped with knowledge, perspective, and firepower.
He counted on America to be passive. He counted wrong.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Brian, actually, I'd like to have you talk about kind of how you got into it. What brought you in to be a corrections officer?
Well, I started with the Department of Corrections back in 1995. I had recently moved to Bakersfield for college, and while I was going to school, I was working a slew of part-time jobs. I would work for a dry cleaner in the morning, then go to school in the afternoons, and then either go to a pizza place at night or a sporting goods store to work. I had several CDC customers at the dry cleaner where they would take their uniforms in to be cleaned, and was suggested by a few of my customers that perhaps the Department of Corrections would be a good place for me to work. That was reinforced one evening when I was working at the sporting goods store in the gun department, and one of my customers came in and recognized me from my previous job and said he thought at first I had a relative that was working at the store. And when I told him that was me working both jobs as well as another job going to school, he subsequently brought me in a job application for CDC and said it would be a good place for me to work. I looked into it. At the time, I had aspirations of law school and continuing on with college, but when money got tight and I could no longer afford school, it was a good alternative. CDC provided me and my family with a good career, and as I got into the work, I saw that it was important work that needed to be done.
Well, that's one of the things. And CDC, California Department of Corrections, I think some people may not realize what that means.
Yes, and it is now CDCR. It is California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, as they have focused more on their rehabilitative efforts.
Well, now it seems like the majority of them are actually out of prison, so maybe they've been rehabilitated.
Maybe.
I doubt it.
I doubt it.
I doubt it. So I think that's actually, when you were telling me the story about how you got into it, and like I said, I think that's a great story for a lot of young people to look at, because that is a great career. I understand it can be a lot of pressure, but it could be a great career for a lot of young folks looking into something that, realistically, you did what, 20?
Just over 27 years. I did 10 years in the prison system and then 17 years in the parole division working on the street.
So in that, how did you go from, you went from being a CDC officer, which is an officer, that's law enforcement. I think a lot of folks miss that.
Yes, they are peace officers under California Penal Code.
So you're post-certified, you have to go through all of that, you have a long academy.
It's a different level of post-certification, but yes, they are post-certified peace officers. The corrections is what I call the bowels of the criminal justice system. It's the unseen part that a lot of people don't know much about, but it is a really important aspect of the criminal justice system. So I did 10 years in the prison system as an officer, then as a sergeant, and then as a lieutenant, and then lateral transferred out to parole, where I gravitated towards gang enforcement because of my prison background coming up through security housing units working maximum security yards.
One of the things that a lot of folks don't understand, and I'll call it fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to actually tour a prison about 3 or 4 years ago. Actually, I guess it's probably closer to 6 years ago now. And you guys have one of the toughest jobs in a lot of ways that I think gets overlooked. It's one of the officers, it might have been you years ago that said it to me or somebody else, said, yeah, there's a lot of downtime in that, but that 10 or 20% when it's go time, it's kind of hell on wheels for all y'all.
Right. I used to say a career in prison is long stints of boredom punctuated with brief moments of panic. And what we get paid for are those brief moments. A lot of law enforcement guys that I've worked with, and I've worked with local police departments, sheriffs, state, federal, and I've gone into prison settings with them to do interviews later of parole violators that were locked up and such. And a lot of them told me, I don't know how you could ever work in here. They were, I don't want to say terrified, but it was a really eye-opening experience when you see that you're very outnumbered by criminals. You don't have a firearm, which a lot of police officers, that's their firearms. That's their teddy bear, and they feel secure and safer when they're carrying their firearm, and you don't get to carry one on the inside. So it's a different world, and it's a different kind of law enforcement, but it's necessary, very necessary part.
When I went through the tour and I actually watched and looked, and we went down with the inmates and looked at one of the cells, and they're wandering around. Like I said, what I saw that you guys had to go through, and there's one officer there at a desk, and I believe he had 100 inmates around him, because there were, 2 in a cell, and they had one person on overwatch. And then that same officer on overwatch was overwatch on another section of 100 inmates. So really, those 2 inmates on the ground are by themselves.
The 2 officers?
The 2 officers. I'm sorry, yes. The 2 officers on the ground are by themselves in a lot of ways. So I think that was when I really looked at that, and I always gave you guys a hard time about it, but I think the officer I was with at the time, I said, you guys can make as much as you want, and I don't care. I think realistically, we don't pay you enough for what you're doing. So that was the impression I came out with that.
Yeah, it's a different environment for sure. It can be a daunting environment. You're outnumbered hundreds to 1. You are unarmed. There's gun coverage in a lot of the places. On lower yards, there's no gun coverage in any of the buildings.
Yeah, I saw one of those, and that was an eye-opener in itself also, because there's a lot more men over there.
Yes, there's in the thousands on a minimum yard. They'll have yards that get up to, where you have 1,000 inmates, and you might have, 20 staff total working on a facility at a time. So, when you're outnumbered 1,000 to 20, you learn to do things a little bit differently. That's
not great odds. So doing that, and then you started moving through the system. You said you became a sergeant. How long did it take you to get to that point?
I'm promoted to sergeant pretty quickly. I was 3.5 years, and I had sergeant stripes on. So I was kind of the Wunderkind. I was the man-child kid supervisor. But I'm pretty savvy, and I was blessed that I worked at an institution facility where I had a lot of senior officers, senior staff. I had been there long enough to know whose advice I could rely on, who I could trust to steer me in the right direction. Same thing when I became a lieutenant.
Well, I think you're a little modest. I've known you for a long time, and you're probably one of the most intelligent people I know. So that I could see why you would promote pretty quickly. So that's I could say that. You would say that about yourself, but I'll say that. So, and being that I've known you for a long time, I could say that out loud.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you went there, you're sergeant, and then you step up into lieutenant. So you did that for 6 years?
I was a sergeant for 6 years, and then a lieutenant for 1 year before I went out into parole.
Okay.
I really wanted an opportunity to work on the street, to work a little more autonomously. As a lieutenant, I started getting involved in more of the administrative duties, running a facility, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do with my career. I wanted a little more action, a little more freedom,
I
a
think
little
it's understandable.
less office work. So, like I said, I went out into parole, and as quickly as I could, I kind of gravitated into gang enforcement. And I was blessed to meet a lot of people here in Kern County in the city of Bakersfield that I worked with who were terrific partners. Allied agencies, the Bakersfield Police Department, the Kern County Sheriff's Department were very good at being partner organizations with us.
I'm going to back up just a second. What was it like that first day when you walked into the prison as an officer? I would picture that as myself as a young guy. Here you are, you're young. You had to get pretty wide-eyed, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, what I remember more than anything is when I was in the academy, we went to institutions up north for on-the-job training. And I went to Mule Creek State Prison, and they walked us onto a facility and told us, oh, we're going to put one or two of you in each housing unit, and they kind of peppered us around the facility. And I walked into housing unit, and the sergeant that was dropping us off said, one upstairs, one downstairs. And so the guy I was with said, I'll go upstairs. And he went upstairs, and I went downstairs onto the floor. The officer that was there looked at me and said, oh, thank goodness you're here. My sergeant told me I could leave as soon as somebody showed up. And I said, I'm just a cadet. And he says, yeah, well, you're here now. And he left. And I was left running a housing unit by myself while my cadet partner and an Overwatch officer, a control booth officer, watched me. And he went to give me his equipment, and I told him, oh, I'm not PC 832. I'm not a peace officer yet. I can't take the baton. We didn't have pepper spray back then. So I had a set of handcuffs, a set of keys, and a wing and a prayer, and I was off running my housing unit. So, I was wide-eyed, wonderful. It was an educational experience, believe me.
Yeah, I would imagine I wouldn't necessarily recommend, being trained that way, but evidently it worked out.
It worked out. And that was a level 4. That was a maximum security yard. So it was, I remembered it was really an experience. And I remember thinking, what did I get myself into? But when I got to Tehachapi up at CCI, I remember I always felt more comfortable on higher security level yards. The inmates were more dangerous, but there was more physical security set up. And I don't know if I found that comforting or what. I knew the potential for violence, mayhem was there on any level yard, but it seemed like it was much more set up to be handled on maximum security yards. So I was more comfortable up there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then you come out of the prisons. You've been there for 10 years. Then you get out into the streets, basically. I mean, that's you're working with all these agencies. What was that like on your first trip out? When you're now you're in a whole different level of what you're doing.
Yeah, it got pretty exciting pretty quickly. It was a very different kind of situation. Same kind of thing. When I went out for on-the-job training with that, I went on a ride-along with a friend of mine. And it was very unnerving when I went to houses. When I would walk up to doors and he'd knock on the door for a home visit, I remember thinking how tense things were and how uneasy everyone felt. And it was very strange. And it was the hairs on my neck were standing up. And after 3 or 4 home visits, I was riding with my friend who was taking me on the ride along, and I asked him, man, is it always like this? I mean, because everybody seems like they're just so on edge. And he tells me, oh, that's because you're here. What do you mean? He says, oh, whenever we show up and there's more than one of us, they think they're going to jail. Because the only time we show up and when there's more than one of us is to arrest them. So when 2 guys are at the door, they get on edge. And I said, oh, okay. So I never thought I would be more at ease, but I was. When it was just me, they were the parolees, or supervised persons as we call them now,
Okay.
were more at ease, and I was more at ease. And I'd been working in prison long enough to be able to establish rapport with people, and where it wasn't that bad. But there were definitely times, especially like I said, if we rolled up and there was more than one of us, sometimes we would just do that because we'd planned a search and we wanted a cover officer. But when we show up 2 and 3 deep to a house, it was a definite, you could feel the anxiety level go up all around.
How often were you going back to the same house?
Well, depending on the supervision level of the parolee, I'd be at their house once, twice, maybe as many as 4 times a month, but that would be a lot for parole supervision. Now, I was blessed when I developed a gang caseload here, and I had nothing but gangsters. The Bakersfield Police Department Special Enforcement Unit was always worked very closely with me. If I ever needed someone to be searched and I wasn't available to do it, I could kind of send them out, and they would do a parole search for me, or be on the lookout for someone who's kind of running from me or avoiding supervision, even if they weren't really on the run yet.
And how many parolees would you be assigned to as a normal?
That has varied widely throughout my career. When I first came into parole, caseloads were through the roof. We were understaffed. There had been a hiring freeze for quite a while. There was times when I had 100 guys on my caseload when I first started. Through different procedural models that were put in place by Department of Corrections and the Parole Division, those caseloads came down to where they were 53 to 1. I remember at one point I've worked specialized caseloads on GPS monitoring where we had 40 to 1 on GPS monitors. So it varies greatly depending on the level of supervision required for each case.
Okay, that makes sense. And when you're looking at that, you're going to be 17 years there. You would be considered the expert on this, I would think. What would be a good number? What's an acceptable ratio?
Well, that depends a lot on the supervision requirements that the department or the state is going to put on someone, I think. Parolees should be supervised at a level that ensures that the case-carrying agent is familiar with what they're doing, what's going on in their life, and is able to intervene when the parolee starts displaying behavior that indicates that he's up to new criminal activity, whether that's drug use, whether it's property crimes, whether it's violent crimes. And that population within parole has shifted to much more violent offenders with law changes that have taken place over the last decade. A lot of the lower level offenders that an agent could work with and work towards rehabilitating were no longer eligible for parole supervision. They went to post-release county supervision. And so the programmable parolees weren't on our caseloads anymore. We were left with gangsters, sex offenders, and severe mentally ill, violent offenders. And so the programmability, the workability, the ability for us to have positive impact and for these guys to make change in their life, that population has been whittled down to where they are very difficult to work with. They are very non-cooperative. They are very programmed into career criminal lifestyles. And so it's put law enforcement painted themselves into a really bad corner.
We had Donnie Youngblood on here a while back, and we were talking about the prison population and how it has affected his world, the sheriff's department. And at one point, and I could be getting the numbers wrong, but it seems like he said at one point there was 172,000 inmates in the CDC system.
I think it hit 180,000.
Yeah.
But that's really close.
Right.
Right around there.
And this was prior to Prop 47. Post Prop 47, it was down to about 90,000.
That's about where it is now.
And that's, his question was, where do you think those 80,000 members or 80,000 inmates are? So looking at that, you've seen these people firsthand. You're right there with them. These 80,000 that we've let out, what is that, in your thoughts, what has that done to society?
Well, it's made it a much more dangerous place to live. California has seen large increases in crime over the last decade. Some of the crime stats don't bear out the property crime spike simply because people have quit reporting their property crimes. A lot of the smaller thefts, burglaries and such go unreported because people don't believe that there's anything law enforcement's going to do about it, so why bother reporting it? And so the reported crimes aren't keeping pace with reality.
Yeah, I think, and that's when we see that when we hear on the news that the crime rates are down, this rate is down. It's not that they're down; they're just not being reported.
They're underreported. If you look, even now, most of your crime stats from the Department of Justice, if you look in the last 2 years, they're on the rise again. The reporting, it's on the rise. So if reported is on the rise, it's really, really on the rise with property crime.
This episode today is brought to you by Branded Feed and Farm Supply over at 4328 Rosedale Highway. They're a locally owned business, but this is where you can get your dog food, your horse feed, your chicken feed, pretty much anything you're going to need for your animals. But at the same time, you could go in there and get all kinds of knowledge. Seth and the gang, they really know what they're talking about. They're very helpful. And really, in going in there, you're supporting a local business. These folks have done a great job over the years. I've worked with them. I've had a great time. They're a lot of fun. And like I said, you can learn a lot just by going in there. Ask the questions. So appreciate it. Support them. They're helping support us. We want to move them forward in this also. Thank you. Branded Feed and Farm Supply. Be sure to support the local business. So you were out there for 27 years. You saw a lot of different laws and things come in. How did this Prop 47 really affect what you would have to do? You had to experience part of that. Because when did Prop 47 come in?
Prop 47 was enacted in 2014.
And when did you retire?
Oh, I retired in 2022.
So there you go. I mean, you had 8 years of having to deal with this excess.
Oh, yeah. And Prop 47, I think, was called the Public Safety Realignment, and it didn't realign it in a good way. But it was intended to bring down the prison population. California was under a federal mandate to reduce their prison population by federal judges' orders to get back into a reasonable percentage of population. We were like 180 some odd percent of design capacity when that came in within our prison systems. They were overcrowded. They were very difficult to manage from a population. So a lot of the property crimes and lower level drug offenses, they turned into misdemeanors so that people wouldn't go to prison for that, as a means to kind of slow down coming in on the front door. At the same time, credit earning and things like that shortened people's existing prison sentences to where they were getting out a little faster on the back end. That saw a huge spike in recent releasees, which, as you know, has a very bad effect on property crime and drug use in and of itself. There's propositions on the ballot this year to try to undo some of that Prop 47.
Yeah, Prop 36, I think, is the
Prop
one.
36, which is not our original Prop 36. We had a Prop 36 back when I was getting into parole.
Oh,
that was mandatory drug treatment in lieu of incarceration. And it was a good program. Prop 36 was a good program until we started letting parolees into it. When we started letting parolees into Prop 36 treatment, they poisoned the people coming in on the front end of the system, the people that where it would still work.
Okay.
These guys, and people don't like to discuss this because people get programmed into becoming a career criminal. That once that's the criminal lifestyle that they know, that's become their career, that's all they know how to do, that's all they want to do. When you let that population mingle with the first-time offender, the person who can get that taste of the criminal justice system and say, oh, no, I don't want this lifestyle, and step away from it, when you let those career criminals interact with them, it poisons them. It's the same with the Scared Straight program. They found out that the kids that they sent in for the Scared Straight started idolizing the prisoners that they saw. They saw how cool and strong and great these guys were and started to aspire to become more like them. So that program kind of backfired.
That's interesting. I never heard that. And you say that out loud, it makes a lot of sense. And you think about society, how it's changed, and because I always thought, well, that should be a pretty cool program and should be helpful, but it has the negative. I can see the negative side of that now. I think that kind of leads to a lot of things of unintended consequences of these propositions and laws that have come through that you've had to deal with. Like I said, Prop 47. When we were talking some time back, there was actually another one we talked about. It wasn't Megan's Law. It was
Jessica's Law?
Jessica's Law. When I looked at that as an outsider looking in, we all think that's a great thing. But there were some unintended consequences on that, right?
Absolutely. And I remember when Jessica's Law was coming out, I was a sex offender agent at the time. I was doing GPS supervision of 290 registrants. And I looked at this law and I said, oh, it's bad law. It's not written correctly. And I voted against it because when it comes to sex offender laws in this state, we write the laws for 2 to 3% of the population of sex offenders. The other 97, 98%, it doesn't apply to them. We still have the stereotype of the guy in the white panel van or the tree jumper or hey, little kid, want some candy? And those guys are such a tiny minority of sex offenders. So when we put all these restrictions on all 290 registrants, and the vast majority of them it should not have applied to, it made things difficult, and it had unintended consequences. In this town, it pushed a lot of sex offenders into small, concentrated little areas, hotels and apartment complexes and stuff. There were only a few places in town where they could live, and we set up small little sex registrant communities, basically. And when these guys all get together, they talk amongst themselves and they become better at being criminals. And it
Going to have their own little union meeting.
Basically, they have their own support groups, I guess. But there are unintended consequences. When you have complex systems that involve millions of people, you can't know all the outcomes. It's too complicated to see until it comes out.
When you think about these 180,000 inmates that were in the system, and now we've changed it to the CDCR, how much rehabilitation how much could it really work? What are we looking at there to really make that a possibility? In your years of experience, I figure what percentage of that 180,000 are truly rehabilitating?
Well, I mean, that's hard to quantify. It really is. But I would say that it sits on a scale or on a spectrum, and the lower level the offender, the newer into the criminal justice system that offender is, the more likely you are to have a return on investment for rehabilitative efforts. The more trips through the criminal justice system, through the court system, through the prison system that a person takes, the more entrenched into that lifestyle that individual becomes. So it's hard to quantify with a number, but I would just say that the earlier in the system that we could try to really rehabilitate someone and either offer them educational, vocational training, the mental health treatment they need, whatever, the more successful that's going to be. Early intervention is the key.
And I don't know much about the systems. Self-admitted, I don't know. When I look at it, and I don't think a lot of other people really do, but inside a prison, it's its own little ecosystem there as far as you've got all the gangs, they're running their own world in there. We'd have to figure out a way to get those young folks or the first-time offenders away.
Yes.
That's the only way I can see that working, I guess.
Well, it's because the criminal organizations, the prison gangs, the street gangs, whatever, they're the replacement families for these kids. When they're teenagers and they're in a home that doesn't have a dad, and kids want structure and kids want paradigms. They want limits. They want to know what their limits are. And when there isn't dad to come in and set those limits, moms can't do it. I'm sorry, not to be sexist. Women aren't built that way. Women love their babies, and they might wag their finger at their babies, and they might spank their babies, but they just love on them and love on them and love on them. And so eventually, especially teenage boys, they'll figure out that they can get away with it with mom. And when they don't have a dad and they don't have those limits, they seek out those kind of structures. And so these gangs step in and provide that structure for them. They become their family. And so they become exceedingly loyal to that gang. What they don't realize is that the upper echelons of these gangs are just sucking them in so they can use the new guys and throw them away.
They're just running cattle through, in their mind, almost
Pretty
in
much,
a way.
pretty much. And the gangsters are notoriously greedy, self-interested, and so they end up backstabbing each other through their own greed within upper echelons. And I've seen it in all kinds of gangs, whether it's prison gangs, street gangs. These guys turn on each other for their own benefit. And once these guys become disenchanted with the gang and realize, oh, these guys were just using me and they're ready to backstab me, and now they want to drop out of the gang and tell, but now they're no good because they're a rat or a dropout, it puts them into a very dangerous, precarious situation. So it's both difficult and dangerous to get out of the gang. So these guys get stuck into that lifestyle, and it's very problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, and I would imagine, and you saw that in the prisons a lot. They're really just they run their own world in there. I mean, they have their shot callers, they have their, and they're controlling all of that. When I think about that, personally, I would love to see a mentor program be set up in the schools for these young guys. But I don't know how we could get to that point. Maybe folks like yourself, maybe get to them young enough.
Something, but we need to be focused on family first. We need to keep two-parent households going.
As much as possible.
That's the key to society, if you ask me, is protection of a nuclear family.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we could pretty much track that back to when we really saw things start, just deteriorating in society. So with that, that's, late 60s, early 60s even maybe, but you could definitely see a lot of that happening there. So in that, you got to have a couple stories of when you're out there running around. Everybody likes to hear a good story. Nothing. Just something you won't put yourself in a bad spot, but there's got to be some fun stories out there.
I think most of my stories would land somebody in jail. And I don't want it to be me.
Yeah, as long as it's not you.
As long as it's not.
I imagine a lot of your stories resulted in people going to jail.
I have a lot of stories where people ended up going to jail, yes. Lots. Lots and lots.
Well, would you recommend young people get into the Department of Corrections?
That's a loaded question. I think there is still good work to be done. There were times when I used to say that I felt like the little Dutch boy, and all I was doing was keeping my finger in the dike and trying to keep the town from just getting flooded out. And you don't feel like you're really doing anything, but the absence of you doing anything is horrific. Yeah. So it is important work to be done. We do need people with strong constitutions and solid work ethics to go into this line of work. It's important work that needs to be done. We also need, younger people who are coming up to be more cognizant and more involved in the day-to-day goings-on of their own community. Be aware of what goes on in your world a little bit, so that you can take local action and start making a difference where you are, where you live. That's important.
One of the things about living here in Bakersfield in Kern County, we have an abundance of prisons in our county.
Prison Valley.
It's Prison Valley. We're pretty well covered up. In that, I've often wondered, and I know a lot of you guys, but we hear about, post-traumatic stress in the military a lot. But I think coming out of the prison systems or working in the prison systems on a daily basis, you guys have to see some things that people could not ever even imagine in their life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You see horrific things. And that's not unique to prison law enforcement. Any law enforcement, any first responder, you encounter people on the worst day of their life all the time. They have just had something horrific go on in their lives. And you're there to help them clean up the pieces and help find out who did it or whatever, however the situation is. And when you do that day in and day out for a long time, it's very stressful. There are times, I'll admit, sitting down to thinking about this and starting to look at and read old policy memos from 10, 15 years ago, I found it stressful.
Did you?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some level of it there, I guess. But retiring was a great career decision for me. I was very happy with my retirement. And in prepping for this and reading policy memos, there's no way I could ever go back to it myself. And you need to be prepared for that if you're going to go into this type of career, is that, much like going into the military, or if you were going to be a firefighter or paramedic or something else, you are going to deal with trauma. You are going to deal with blood, guts, violence, hate, all that. And you need to have a strong enough will, strong enough constitution to be prepared for that, to handle it. So, yes, I would like to see younger people taking a more active interest in going into law enforcement. I know a lot of law enforcement organizations are having an extremely difficult time finding qualified applicants because the people who can do the job can't seem to pass a background check. And the people that can pass the background check aren't really fit to do the job because it does take a very specific set of qualities to be able to do this job.
I would imagine you have to really work on separating work and home and do everything you can to leave that at the prison when you leave.
Yes, compartmentalization is pretty important, to not let that. And I always tried not to let it bleed into my family life. Obviously it did. You try to not expose your family to those things, but at the same time, your family is your support network.
Right.
And you need to be able to lean on them a little bit, so you have to give them, small bits so that they can share that experience with you. But at the same time, you don't want to taint your family with that kind of stuff. You go deal with that kind of stuff so that they don't have to.
Does the Department of Corrections have some programs available for officers?
Oh, yeah.
To do
They
that?
have an employee assistance program that's pretty good, very accessible to employees and their families.
I've heard that with law enforcement, on the street also with BPD, Sheriff's Department, regular law enforcement officers. It has a little bit of a stigma in a way if they take advantage of those.
Yes.
Is that kind of the same for the CDC, or is it a little more quiet?
No, it's across the board. It's the same way. Anybody who asks for help, it's a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
And so if you're weak, you can't be doing the job. There is that stigma that goes with it. But I think people are overcoming it now. That stigma is lessening as things go on. By the same token, I think people are being brought up to be more aware of mental health issues, extremely so, it seems like in California now. But it's important that people are able to seek help when they need it.
Yeah.
Because I've seen things by the same token go very bad. I've lost coworkers to suicide and such because they didn't feel like they had anyone that could help them.
Yeah, I know we've lost quite a few in the past 5 or 6 years. That, 'cause like I said, we still have friends that are in that field. So I could definitely see that. So looking into that, I want to see young people get into this. I want to see, because we know we need to have it. It needs to be there. How could these young folks prepare a little bit before they go in, do you think? What would be
Oh, man. I wish I knew. I don't know how you toughen these kids up. I don't know how else to put it. The kids need to get tougher. We're raising them soft.
Very much so.
It started with the whole I just want my kids to be happy movement. When we started parenting on that style where we just wanted to make our kids happy, we started taking on too much and taking too much away from them where we didn't give them the coping skills to deal with negative emotions and negative circumstances. And, we're seeing the unintended consequences of we just want our kids to be happy now.
Yeah. I feel bad I brought you into the PTS stuff after asking you to be on this broadcast.
No. I mean,
hell, I don't want to have to do that to you. But
no. But it reminded me when I was going through, and I've still got an old binder in my house and everything. So I went flipping through that and just reading those old policy memos and remembering the changes and remembering the things and every time something else came down the pipe from Sacramento, thinking at the time, oh my God, what are they doing to this department? And it's tough to run now. I mean, where the department is now versus where it was when I started, it's almost unrecognizable, the differences.
Well, that's it. We originally talked about this conversation about Prop 47 and how that affected a lot of things. And in that, there had to be a lot of different rules and laws and things that had a negative effect on your ability to do your job back then. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, it made a lot of changes that it was the catalyst that started things snowballing. It wasn't like Prop 47 did it all at once.
No, I mean, there was other ones out there that did it also.
There were other ones, but then Prop 47 led to administrative changes and policy changes and things that came down the pipe over the next 4, 5, 6 years that kind of snowballed into the mess.
You know, in that, when I look at all those things that affected that and how that worked out. But you did retire. You're having a good life now.
Oh, yeah.
You're having a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah.
Did it make you a little more aware, put a little paranoia in a way as you got older?
Absolutely. Working in law enforcement, you become very hyper-vigilant, which is a lot of the stress level that law enforcement has to go through, is that you need to be a little more aware of your surroundings all the time. And that comes with stress because, like I said, we do the things that we do so that our friends and family don't have to experience those things. So we take on more of that to ourselves. And that can be very stressful.
You know, and in that, I mean, the name of the podcast here is Every Citizen Armed. You were out in the field a lot. You were out there running around with these folks, but there are a lot of citizens carrying firearms legally and illegally.
Yes.
Do you recommend more folks carry legally?
Absolutely. I think an armed society is a polite society. I really do believe that. I think that it comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. You are going to have the power of life and death on your hip. That comes with a lot of responsibility. And as a gun owner, you need to take that very seriously. And that is abiding by your gun laws, practicing with your firearm, being proficient with your firearm, being safe with it, storing it correctly, et cetera, et cetera. But I think responsible gun owners is very important in maintaining a functioning society.
Yeah, I obviously feel that way, and we've always kind of pushed that along, you know, that's the way it should be. And when we look at that, the responsible gun ownership is what I really wish we could get through more and more, because we do see a lot of folks. You brought up storing it. How many times that happens, and and I've been guilty of that myself, put it in a place probably shouldn't have been. You know, lock the guns up when you don't need them.
Yeah, storage at home is a huge thing, especially if you have children. Now I have grandchildren in the house. You know, obviously I have a pistol safe, and then I have a regular gun safe. So I have one quick access and one or several others that are locked up in a safe. And I've seen too many people that put them in drawers, you know, drop them in a sock, whatever. That's just bad firearms handling.
Right. Yeah, that's not good.
Because that was my other thing too. Is I was a range master for the state for 15 years, and trying to get law enforcement officers to be safe with their firearms was hard enough, but John Q. Public is that much harder.
I actually heard a story the other day about a range officer who thought he was holding a dummy gun, and he was not, while he was trying to explain this to the class, and he fired a round, and it went through the wall. Didn't hit anybody, luckily, but I think he was looking for a job pretty shortly after that.
There's a pretty famous video of an officer, I want to say it's Florida, don't hold me to that, who's giving a classroom presentation on his firearms. And he proceeds to, while he's talking to this classroom full of students, shoot himself in the foot. As he's giving them a lecture about how he's the only one qualified in the room to handle his firearm, and he puts a round through his foot, and then wants to keep teaching the class.
Oh.
And then he goes to pick up another firearm, something else like his AR or something, and the kids go, oh, no, and they get up and they want to start leaving the room. So
you've lost your credibility.
Kids know. Yeah,
yeah, I think that
the secret's out.
Yeah, exactly.
So
in that, okay, responsible gun ownership. How often, I mean, you're out there, you're a range master.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing the officers come in, they have to qualify what, once a month?
Quarterly.
So
4 times a year.
That's not a lot.
That's not a lot. And amongst the range officers that we had up there, we used to say the vast majority of our peace officers, who we lovingly referred to as social workers with guns, the only day they touched their guns was on range day.
Yeah.
They would pick it up, they would clean it, they would go qualify with it, and then it would sit dirty in their holster until their next range date. Then they would clean it right before range, go in and qualify with it. Because we would do a firearms inspection to make sure their weapon was clean before we let them qualify.
You go.
So they would clean it right before they went to range, and then they wouldn't touch it again for 90 days. And that's just not, you cannot stay proficient. Firearms handling, it's a perishable skill, just like any physical skill that you do. If you don't practice it all the time, you don't maintain a high level of proficiency. So part of responsible gun ownership is going out and shooting or finding a way to train with your firearm in some way. There are different trainers now that you can use. I'm a big fan of one of them that I use so I can train without actually having to fire my firearm. You know, it gives me feedback on how I'm shooting and how I'm drawing. And
Oh, okay.
so
And which one is, I mean, mind sharing that?
it's a Mantis X is what I use.
Okay.
It's a great little thing. It's a little sensor that clips onto your firearm and then has an app onto your phone and will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about what you're doing with that firearm.
Oh.
I was amazed at how accurate it is. And you can be placed on anything. It can be put on rifles, shotguns, pistols, bow and arrow.
Oh.
It's a good product. And then because you're just dry firing, you don't go through all that ammunition cost,
Yeah, which
which
got out of hand.
gets out of hand. It was one thing when I was a range master and I was getting free state ammo.
Right.
That's one thing. Now that I'm having to buy that stuff, that's
With the
something
little
else.
extra tax we put on in California
Yeah.
alone. That made it
Thanks,
really
guys.
nice. Yeah, thanks, Newsom. Appreciate that. So, well, do you mind tell me, what are you doing now?
Well, I still work security. So I work for a little company called the Los Angeles Dodgers. They hire off-duty and retired law enforcement to work security at the stadium. I've been there now for, I think it's my 8th year.
Oh, wow.
So I worked for several years, kind of moonlighted there, and then I retired, and it just became my only job. And it's been fantastic.
Oh, I bet. Well, especially now.
Especially now when I'm waiting for the World Series to see if it comes back or find out if I'm unemployed right at the end of the week. One way or another, I'll be unemployed by the end of the week.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there you go. There you go. But that's got to be fun.
It's been a lot of fun. And it's been nice to maintain some law enforcement contact. It's hard to quit law enforcement cold turkey after that long.
That's a good point.
Being around those personalities, because the law enforcement has a personality, you know. Being around that for that long, if you step away from it completely, you kind of get withdrawals. So it's keeping me around law enforcement just enough to where it makes me chuckle when the active duty guys come to work and they're telling me about, you know, an arrest they went on or what's went on. Oh yeah, I want to hear all about it, please.
Yeah.
It makes me smile and laugh now. So
Yeah, you don't have to deal with that anymore. You could live vicariously through them, right?
exactly, and I don't have to smell it anymore. It's great.
Yeah, that is the one thing I will tell you when I went through that prison. Now, and I was there in
They
December.
smell like goats, don't they?
Oh my God. That was one of the worst smells. I just cannot imagine. Like I said, that was December in Delano. So I would
okay.
imagine July,
July and August are
that's got to be horrendous. Worse than any dairy I've ever driven by. So,
And if you go up to some of the institutions farther up north, I remember DVI up in Tracy, they had a dairy on the prison grounds. So you got the dairy and the prison together, and it was just a lovely combination of smells.
I would have taken the dairy. Absolutely. That was the day I looked at that and Scotty was giving me the tour, and I just thought, my God, this state does not pay you enough to do this job. And the officers that I've always dealt with, I've always come across pretty good guys. You know, you and the other guys have always been pretty good guys. But I would imagine you've seen a pretty good amount wash out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the thing about working in a prison is, like at Tehachapi, I think we had something like 1,000 officers working up there when I got there. Anytime you get a population that big, you're going to have bad apples.
Sure.
You know, in anything, whether you're car salesmen or cops or, you know, heart surgeons, you get a population that big and you're going to have good ones and bad ones. And so I've seen people do things that are felony stupid and seen do things that are criminal and things like that. Seen people I work with get arrested. I've seen people I've worked with end up in orange jumpsuits. And some of them tried to end up being on my caseload when I was on parole. And so I'd have to go to my boss and say, I can't supervise this person. I know him.
Yeah.
I worked with him.
Wow. That had to be interesting.
Yeah, that's no good at all.
No, I would not imagine. Well, I think that's great. Like I said, I appreciate you coming up. If there's anything that we didn't cover that you would like to put in here?
Just that I know we were going to be talking about Prop 47 and how it changed the landscape of law enforcement in California, and that Prop 36, the new Prop 36 that's coming out, looks to kind of step back on some of that. So it's going to re-elevate certain property crimes back to felonies. It's going to re-elevate certain drug possessions back to felonies. And it creates a drug court again, which we've actually had in California before.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
So it's going to create a new judicial system for drug diversion, wherein if an individual completes the treatment successfully, their conviction is erased.
Okay.
So much like they tried to do with N numbers in the civil addicts program decades ago, the problem with that program was it had too long of a tail, if you ask me. Nobody could complete the treatment because it had a 10-year tail. And
Nobody's
so
going to hang around that long.
nobody who's a real drug addict can stay clean that long under that kind of supervision for that long. And so guys would almost always fail it and go back to court and say, just give me the conviction and let me do my time. Because they would give up on it. This one is shorter and I think is better set up, but I haven't seen all the nuances of that, so I can't really stamp it and say, yeah, it's great, but I really do believe it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that brings me to a thought, actually, and you probably have a pretty good idea about it. The 3-strike laws back, and I know we've pretty much wiped those out. How did you feel about the 3-strike law?
Well, I think it was a little bit broad in its application, but I think it's a good idea because people don't just wake up one day in jail facing felony counts. They work their way into probation and jail, diversion, then prison. And by the time you're on your 3rd prison term, you've had so many runs through the criminal justice system that, yeah, by then it's time to put somebody on a shelf for quite a while.
Back then, we had a grocery business. We had a grocery store. And I always think back to the people that we would stop shoplifting or whatever, whatever the case was back then. And everybody always thought it was just minor stuff. Well, they're just shoplifting. Well, they're just doing this. Well, then they would, then it was a fight. Now it's assault. Now it's this. And it didn't matter how many different things they did. That always got pled down. So it might have been a felony at some point. It was a violent felony sometimes. But they would get pled down to a misdemeanor and released. So really, by the time I always felt when they got to that 3rd strike, they've actually probably committed 10 violent felonies at that point because our DAs tend to plead them down a lot.
Quite possibly. They could have had 10 or more. But even if it was just 3 felonies, by the time you've gone through 3 felonies and you're in your 3rd prison term, you aren't afraid of prison anymore.
No.
You probably don't have much of a life outside of your prison life. And that's the thing with a lot of these guys is they're someone in prison. They have status in prison. They're powerful in prison. Then they go out on the street and they're nobody on the street. And so, that's their life, the prison life. So by the time they've done that, they've victimized enough people to where we really do need to think about removing them from society,
Oh, yeah.
But the logistics of that is very problematic, very expensive, and in times dangerous.
And I hear that a lot. It's really expensive to keep somebody in prison. Yeah, but what's the cost of keeping them out?
We used to say it costs more to keep somebody in the state pen than it does to send them to Penn State.
Yeah. One of the things that you brought up, and because we talk about the 47 again, actually, we'll go back to that, and it just came back to mind. Who pushed Prop 47? You did a little research on this, and I thought that was very interesting.
And as it turns out, George Soros was one of the major financial backers of Prop 47, just like he was a major financial backer in a lot of local district attorney races where we started getting very liberal district attorneys and crimes were not getting prosecuted. And it leads me into a lot of conspiracy theories about what I actually think is going on, but that's my theories.
Well, and I wish people would really look at that because, I like a good conspiracy theory like anybody else. But he has done more damage to our society, to the United States in general, in my opinion, than probably anybody in a long time. Of all the DAs that he's put in place, you look at what's going on in L.A., you look at, all the amazing amount.
Yeah, it's been a huge movement across the country to undermine our criminal justice system and to create a lot of chaos within our society. And, I don't want to go too far with it, but I really do think that there's an organized movement to subvert this nation.
Oh, I think there is.
They've shown for decades that you can't really beat the United States from the outside. You have to beat it from the inside. And there's an organized effort to try to beat the United States from the inside.
I think there was a Russian immigrant that said something about that back in the, maybe it was early 80s, but maybe 70s. I don't remember his name, but he talked about that. He said, Russia's not going to come over and destroy you by war. We're going to take you down from within. Mm-hmm. And they started young. Yeah,
there have been several books written on how to topple the United States. And if you look, what's been going on in the last 10 years or so has been, pages right out of those books.
Yeah, it's right there. It's textbook. So, well, we'll end on a fun note, and it's just something I know you've told me in the past with your new job. Mm-hmm. One of the great things that you got to do is you escorted Vin Scully.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, fun story. When I took the job with the Dodgers back in 2017, I was a Padre fan. I had been a pretty much lifelong Padre fan. I had kind of fallen out of love with the Padres when they got rid of Bruce Bochy. And I remember their ownership saying something about they didn't think he was a very good manager. And then all he did was go to San Francisco and start winning World Series.
Yeah, I always liked him.
And I was even raised by my dad, who was a Yankee fan, to be a bit of a Dodger hater. So I remember telling the vice president of security of the Dodgers that I had taken the job so I could throw Dodger fans out of Dodger Stadium. And he thought that was pretty funny. And I told him, well, I don't get awestruck by being around the Dodgers. I'm not a fan of theirs. So I treat them like the merchandise. And I'm the security guard here to make sure that nobody messes with the merchandise. So later that season, I was assigned to Vin Scully. He was coming to the stadium on a game day for a speaking engagement before the game. And then he was going to go into the press box for a while. Then he was going to go into the owner's suite for a while. And I truly believe walking through Dodger Stadium with Vin Scully is like walking into church with Jesus on Easter Sunday. We would walk down the concourse and the crowds would part and the place would fall silent. Silent as a church. And you could just hear whispers of parents telling their children and people, oh, that's Vin Scully, that's Vin Scully. And you just hear his name whispered everywhere. It was like spooky. And this man was so gracious and so personable and such a tremendous individual. I watched him interact with dozens of people throughout the day, people who I thought he was lifelong friends with. Turns out he didn't know them at all.
Yeah.
He was just so adept at dealing with members of the public that by the time that day was over, I was a Dodger fan. That's all there was to it.
How could you not be?
How could you not be? He really was fantastic.
That's good. Like I said, I think that's a great way to end this, and I appreciate you coming up and taking all this time and walking us through what your career was like and then how some of like I said, there's certain things are affecting this even to this day with the Prop 47 and 36 and things to that extent. But now, like I said, now you get to go have the fun stuff.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Best of all, a 5-star review is much appreciated.